It's a short walk up to that podium, but it takes thousands of steps to get there. Steps that are unfamiliar. Steps you're not so sure about. Steps that shake your confidence. No one said it would be easy, but no one told you it would be this hard. And while many never finish that walk, you keep pressing on. Course Hero is here to help along the way with in-depth study documents, practice problems, and 24/7 tutoring for all your classes to keep you moving forward and learning deeper. Course after course, semester after semester, year after year. Until you take your last steps as a college student and your first steps as a college graduate.
That's pretty cool, right? That's the first time we've ever had a brand anthem video in our life. So you're the first people to ever see that. And hopefully in back to school campaign, when it comes about, we're going to be sharing that with a lot more people. I hope you're having fun. Listening to that last panel, what I was thinking, what I was really liking is how empathetic it was, and it was focused on people and focused on the student. And this combination both between our intellectual selves and our emotional selves in trying to bridge the gap between the two. I always find it really interesting to try to take information that's qualitative and quantitative and connect them. That's what was going through my mind, and then this day has been incredibly special. Maybe like Tara, I just got to be on stage next to Sir Ken. That's pretty awesome. And you know, back in February, we were thinking as a team, who would we want to keynote our education summit coming up in the summer? And it became pretty clear who the perfect person would be after, you know, when we think about some of the principles that we hold dear at Course Hero. A couple of them are that we try to always be learning, we try to be gritty, and that's how we think we should be acting to get better, to be learning, to grow. And that's us as entrepreneurs, as employees. But how different is that actually from what we would expect from students? How different is that from what we would expect as educators? It's pretty amazing how universal of a principle that is when I was thinking about it. And the pattern recognition, I think, is interesting in different contexts. And we are coming from so many different disciplines here, from many different geographies. But finding something that's a common denominator is powerful. And to hear the teachings that Sir Ken Robinson preaches and shares is really powerful, because when he's talking about creativity, innovation, and education, he acknowledges the fact that there's failure. And I think I love what he talks about when you talk about failure. It's how we approach the failure that matters. And you can do it in a productive way, and you can do it in an unproductive way. And understanding how to approach it and how to use it, I think, is incredibly powerful. And it's amazing to have such an internationally recognized person on education and innovation that we're about to be thrilled by. I'm pretty sure. By the way, I was just thinking from today, the great Jim Valvano said, if you live, a perfect day is where you think, you laugh, and you cry. And I did that today. And yeah. Then he said, if you do that 7 days a week, something special happens. So let's keep it going. Sir Ken Robinson.
So no pressure, I think. Thank you, Andrew. Has it been a good day? Yeah. I asked because I started out today in Anaheim, actually, in Anaheim, with the Better Together California Teachers Conference. Yeah, it's fantastic. You know, there were, I think, 1,200 people at CSU Fullerton, but then another, I think they estimated 12,000 teachers at 30 centers across California. So it's a massive coming together of collaboration across the state. So that's where we were this morning. And I was hoping to get here for Robert Reich's talk, but the plane was late. So I'm just imagining it was fantastic. Yeah. But here's the thing. I have lived in America now for 17 years. And I came out originally in 2001, which was 3 months before 9/11. So we had 3 months of the old America. And everyone says, you know, what a watershed it was. But we came at the beginning of the Bush administration, the good old days. The golden age of the Bush administration, as we now think of it. Yeah, he said history would judge him fairly, and you know, well, it came to be true, didn't it? And then through Obama, and now. Now, the thing is that for the past 17 years, more or less, I have been on a green card in America, and I have been officially registered as a resident alien. So thank you for that. That's great. Yeah, and yet I move among you. And I'm taken as one of your own. But on Tuesday, after due process, I showed up at the LA Convention Center and took the oath of allegiance and became a citizen of the United States. Thank you. So my fellow Americans, if I can... It was a fantastic ceremony. There were about 4,500 people there who were becoming citizens that day, with about 2,000 family members. The judge spoke. For the purpose of this ceremony, the LA Convention Center is deemed to be a courthouse. And she spoke beautifully about what it meant to join to become a citizen of America, how people were all entitled now to equal opportunities, how all people were treated fairly, how this was a land of opportunity, and that many of the people, of course, had endured all kinds of hardships to get here, but this was a country founded on the principles of freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, all of which is true. The thing is, in order to get through the citizenship exam, you have to study the Constitution, which I did. I read it, and it's a fantastic document, as you know. There are various papers, they're called the federal papers. I didn't know this, you know this, you were brought up with it, I wasn't. I was brought up in England. And so I also read the Declaration of Independence, which is a bit overwrought, frankly, I think. Honestly, get over it. You know, but the framers were brilliant people, clearly. But among the federal papers, there's a comment from Thomas Jefferson, or a section, which comes to in the documents you have to look at for the citizenship exam, in which he says something like, this is a document written by a group of people at a particular moment in their history, and it represents their best efforts to address the circumstances we currently face. And future generations will undoubtedly look at this document with a view to reinterpret it, and I urge people who do look at it to keep in mind the circumstances in which it was composed and the challenges for which it was designed. And this is a very wise counsel, isn't it? Because there are certain features of the Constitution which I think, I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, have been rather taken out of context, like the Second Amendment. It's rather taken out of context, I think. I mean, it was designed to help people defend themselves for some unknown paranoid reason against the British. I mean, what was wrong? Honestly, if ever a nation was ungrateful, you know, to the constant support and encouragement you were given, frankly, it's a disgrace. But anyway, so I took the oath of allegiance, but I felt more relaxed about it than I might have been, because I realized if I'm ever challenged in the future, if people say to me, look, you swore that you would uphold the values of the American Constitution, I can simply say, no, sorry, I meant won't. No, I'm sorry. 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 I misspoke. No, I don't uphold the values. Sorry, was that not clear? But you see, what strikes me as shocking about it, I mean, I'm not making judgments or presumptions about people's politics, about which party you may side with, but I'm sure Robert Reich commented on it, that to have groups of lawyers poring through the Constitution, trying to see if there's some way of wrangling it to come up with the idea that the president can pardon himself, is so horribly against the spirit of the document. It seems to me extraordinary, if I can say so, for all the brilliance of the Constitution. It seems to me very odd that the Constitution, the framers, designed a document to free themselves from a despotic monarchy and built into it the circumstance to create a new one. Because it is actually there, isn't it? And I was suggesting to somebody recently that it'd be very wonderful, wouldn't it, very interesting, to commission somebody who's closely familiar with the history and circumstances of the Constitution, how it was framed, and the history, of course, of the United States, and write a speech on the assumption, imagining that Thomas Jefferson or John Adams came back and spent a couple of weeks in America right now and was invited to give a speech to Congress about how he thought the Constitution played out in practice, because some of the things that are going on are they not way beyond the possible imagination of the people who composed the document. Now, I'm not saying this for any other reason than to say that, for reasons I want to touch on, life is inherently unpredictable, non-linear, full of fractured twists and turns, and open to all kinds of unexpected interpretations of well-intentioned plans and strategies. And I think, for example, in relation to this, that one of the great principles of the American Constitution, of the American adventure, is equality of opportunity for all. And probably the way that most people would imagine those opportunities would be best presented would be through the education system. And my big concern for a very long time, not just here, by the way, I'm only telling you I've become a citizen because I think you should know, and because I'm pleased about it, is that most of our education systems were founded on the idea that people have tremendous natural potential, waiting on the opportunity to cultivate it and to be given the chance to pursue these opportunities. And for a whole bunch of reasons, I think one of the greatest betrayals that we've visited on subsequent generations since the introduction of mass education is the perversion of the education system to narrow economic and specific sorts of political ends. So a lot of my work in education for a long time has been about trying to, for my own benefit really, is to understand what the potential of education is, its place in the order of things, and what sort of education we ought, as a matter of right, to be offering our citizens and our kids. And it's always concerned me that very many people have gone through the whole of their education system without really discovering who they are, what their potential is, what their possibilities are. Now, the other thing that's happened to us recently is that my wife and I, Terry and I have been together now for 42 years, Terry and I. Can you blame her? I don't think so. I don't think so. Would you walk away from this? I don't think so. Obviously not. No, Terry is fantastic. And I met her in, when was it now? I don't know if you care about this really, but I mean, no, I can tell you, it was 1977. I was running, with others, a project on the importance of drama in schools. I mean, I know a lot of people, I imagine anyway, came across the work I've been doing through the talks I gave at TED. And I think some people think I was invented at TED. You know, I'm some sort of clone or something. And I remember a few years ago, I was at an event in, I think it was Grand Valley State University. I was there to talk to the students. And I had lunch with the faculty. And over lunch, one of the faculty said to me, "You've been at this a long time now, haven't you?" I said, "What's that?" He said, "Trying to transform education." I said, "I have, yeah." He said, "What is it now, 7 years?" I said, "How do you mean 7 years?" He said, "You know, since that TED talk." I said, "Yes, but I was alive before that. You know, that was that was a thing, you know." Now, I've been at this a long time, and my introduction to all this was I got very interested in drama in schools, or theatre, as we call it here, and its potential for helping kids not only explore deep social questions, but also their own values, their relationships with other people. It's a fundamentally important part of the educational process, along with the other arts. I mean, when I talk about creativity, I don't just mean the arts, I mean everything that involves any creative activity, but I was especially interested to start with in the arts. I just actually gave a talk last year in London, at the London School of Contemporary Dance, on why dance is as important in education as mathematics. Because it is. I'm perfectly prepared to argue that. And so are the other arts. I mean, this isn't an argument against the sciences or the STEM disciplines, but it is an argument for the parity of the humanities, the arts, performing arts, the literary arts, in the rounded education of all children. So I was originally involved very much with drama, and at the time we were involved in an effort to try and understand its real place. So I met Terry because she was teaching in a really difficult school in Liverpool, an elementary school in Liverpool. She had 42 kids in her class. And the whole place was like an Aladdin's cave. I mean, she was just like she really was. She was like a whisperer, you know. I mean, she just brought the place alive. The whole school actually was great in a very difficult part of the city. And I've always felt that the problem is not students. It's not teachers. It's the system. And I mean, it's easy to say that. It's hard to do something more about it. But that's really what I've been concerned about. So Terry and I, so we've been together all this time. And we have 2 children of our own. And our daughter, Kate, 3 months ago, had our first grandchild, who is, and now I know all people think that their grandchildren are, you know, special, and I feel sorry for other people who think that, because by a remarkable coincidence, this is the most beautiful and brilliant child that's been born in recent history. Which brings me to the main part of my presentation, the 800 photographs and 32 videos that I thought you'd like to see. This extraordinary prodigy who is currently languishing in Liverpool, in London. So Adeline was born 3 months ago, and you know, all this sort of stuff gives you cause to reflect, does it not? And you know, Adeline, like every child, every newborn, is an absolute learning organism, you know, a bundle of possibilities. Every human being born has unfathomable capacities and talents, of which we only ever really, I'm sure, discover a small part. You know, human resources, it seems to me, are like the world's natural resources, and the analogy isn't an accidental one, because we are of the earth when it comes to it. But, you know, they are highly diverse. You know, all of us here in the room, we all have different talents ourselves, and among us we have a whole range of talents, some of which other people don't share at all. Diversity is the hallmark of human life, as it is in every natural ecosystem. They're often buried beneath the surface. You have to go looking for them and try and discover them. They're not just lying about on the surface. I did a book a few years ago called The Element, How Finding Your Passion Changes Everything. And it's about how finding your passion changes everything. And we struggled for some time to find a decent talent, and that kind of sprung out at us. I interviewed lots of people about how they discovered the thing that, well, you know, what I mean by this is that that a lot of people don't enjoy the work they do, especially, often not the lives they lead, the relationships they're in, not necessarily. But I also meet people who absolutely love what they do, and they couldn't really imagine doing anything else. You know, if you ask them, why don't you do something else, they'd wonder what you meant. They say, well, this isn't what I do, this is who I am. You know, this identifies me. They are in their element. They consider themselves to be at their most authentic when they do whatever this thing is they're doing. So I wanted to find out more about that. And I interviewed lots of people who believed that they were doing what they felt was really what they were here to do. I don't mean in some metaphysical sense, but the sense in which, but I do mean it in a spiritual sense, the sense in which your spirits are high. You know, there's a difference, isn't it, between physical energy and spiritual energy. By what I mean by that is that you can, if you do something that you love, you may be physically exhausted by it. You know, you look at athletes or anybody, you know, who's involved in work, or dancers or musicians or people who pull all-nighters working on research that fascinates them. You may be physically exhausted by your efforts, but spiritually buzzing with the fulfillment of having done it. And that's when you know you're in your element, because if you're in your element, it gives you energy. It gives you that sort of energy. It feeds your spirit in a way that other things don't. You know what it's like? I mean, if you're doing something you love to do, an hour can feel like 5 minutes. If you're doing something you don't care for, 5 minutes can feel like an hour. You know, you look at the clock and think, really? and it's the same with people, isn't it? It's exactly the same with people. You know, there are some people in your life, and you light up when they come in the room. You know, think, oh, that's fantastic. You know, they're here, and you know, because they feed you. You know, I mean, not literally, but they exhilarate you being in their presence. I don't mean you go around sort of with a rose clamp between your teeth and tap dancing, but you just feel better for them being there. And of course, if that's a deep affinity, then you're in love with them. I mean, that's what we mean by it, really. You have that deep synergy with somebody. And on the other hand, there are some other people who just suck the energy straight out of you. Don't they? You find this at work sometimes. You see somebody coming down the corridor, you think, really? What now? You know, can we reschedule? You know, it's not because they're bad people, they're just exhausting, you know, and there are other people who love them. It's very hard to overestimate the power and importance of spiritual energy. With a small s. I don't mean in the religious sense. I do not mean that, but it doesn't entail that. I mean the sense in which your spirits are up or buzzing or they're down. So you find people who are absolutely in their element, who are fed by this thing. It doesn't make them altogether lovely people to be around necessarily, but it means they are fulfilled in the way that often they're not. So talent is highly diverse, and it's hidden. Being in your element, by the way, isn't just finding things you're good at. I mean, I was very keen to say that. It's not enough to be good at something. There are plenty of people who are good at things they don't care for. A lot of people are in occupations, not because they enjoy it, but because they're good at it. The second book I was involved in. Actually, it was the third. Do you care which book it was? I mean, is it... Is this a deal breaker if I can't clarify this? I had this fantastic editor on it. It was a book about the arts and schools. Wonderful woman called Millicent, and she was a very good editor. She was a bit too good, frankly. You know, she kept correcting my sentences, which is a very poor habit, I think, in an editor. The editor's job is to say, this is brilliant. Honestly, I can see no possible room for improvement. Anyway, but she didn't take that view. But so in order to distract her and try and undermine her confidence at one point, I said to her, how long have you been doing this? And she said about 5 years. Now, she was in her late 30s at this point, so I said, what did you do before? And she said that she had been a concert pianist. I said, now you're an editor? She said, yeah. I said, what happened? She said, I gave it up. I said, why? And she said, because I was doing a concert one evening in London, and I got to the end of the concert, and we went out for dinner, me and the conductor, and he said to me, Millicent, you were very good this evening. She was a very accomplished professional musician. And he said to her, you were very good, Millicent, this evening. She said, well, thank you very much. And he said, but you didn't enjoy it, did you? She said, how do you mean? He said, well, I mean, did you? Did you enjoy it? The performance? She said, no, not really. He said, do you enjoy it? Do you enjoy performing? She said, no. He said, well, why do you do it? And she said, well, I suppose because I'm good at it. And he said, you know, being good at something isn't a good enough reason to spend your life doing it. And she said she went home and thought about it. And you know, the story was that she'd been raised in a musical family. She went to a musical high school. She went to the Royal College of Music, did a degree, then she did a doctorate of music. And as the night followed the day, she progressed onto the concert platform. And said nobody had ever stopped to ask her if she wanted to. She said, I didn't ask myself if I wanted to. I just took it for granted that's what I'd be doing. I said, but I realized that weekend that what I really loved was books. And I never went to musical salons, I went to literary salons. I used to hang out with authors and editors, and I was absorbed every minute I wasn't on stage reading and keeping up with literary reviews. So I realized I was denying this part of me that I was taking for granted, but really defined who I was. And so she said, I finished the season, I closed the piano lid, and I've never opened it again. And I've spent my life as an editor. And she said, I have never been happier, never poorer, never more harangued by disgruntled authors, but never happier. So to be in your element, it isn't enough to be good at something, you have to love it. I mean, in the sense that it gives you energy and you feed off doing it. And you know what I'm talking about, you know when that happens. So I interviewed lots of people about how that came to be in their lives. And this point about energy being, or talent being hidden is very important. One of the people I interviewed for the book was Paul McCartney, the bass guitarist of the popular music group, the Beatles. And you have to remember, I am from Liverpool. Well, perhaps you don't remember, because I didn't tell you. Yeah, okay, I've told you now, so try and remember that. I was born in Liverpool in 1950, and I went to school in the city centre, and he went to school across the city centre. He's older than me, as you can tell, but falling apart, frankly. But no, but I asked him if he enjoyed music at school, and he said no, he didn't. Incidentally, I'm telling you this because I think it's very important that you don't leave here this evening without understanding that I hang out with Paul McCartney. So Paul McCartney, or Paul, as I call him. No, actually, he went to school across the city centre, and his old school it closed. We both went to grammar schools in Liverpool, and both of our schools closed down with changes in local authority education funding. And his old school was reopened under his patronage to become one of Europe's leading tertiary centres for the performing arts. It's called the Liverpool Institute for the Performing Arts. It's a fantastic school. And I helped them get this off the ground in the early days, which is how I came to meet him. My old school, for interest, burnt down. So passing over that, I said to Paul McCartney, he agreed that we could chat about the book, and I asked him if he enjoyed music at school. And he said he didn't enjoy it at all. I said, did your music teacher, this is in Liverpool in the late 1950s, I said, did your music teacher think you had any musical talent? He said, no, not really. He does, doesn't he? One of the other people in the same music program in the same school, but 2 years younger than him, was George Harrison, the lead guitarist of the popular music group, the Beatles. So I said to Paul, did your music teacher think George had any talent? He said, no, not at all. Well, he did, didn't he? I said, well, look, would this be a reasonable comment to make that there was this one music teacher in Liverpool in the late 1950s who had half the Beatles in his class, and he missed it? He said, that's right. Well, it's a bit of an oversight, isn't it? Do you think? Anybody show any promise in your class this year, Mr. President? Not really. Nobody jumps out, frankly. And, you know, I've been at this a long time now. You know, I can spot it. Elvis Presley went to school in Tupelo, Mississippi. A friend of mine's made a documentary, interviewed his school friends. And evidently, Elvis Presley was not allowed in the glee club at school because they said he would ruin their sound. Elvis. Well, we all know what great heights the glee club went on to. You know, and managed to keep Elvis out of the picture. Albert Einstein couldn't stand mathematics, evidently, at school. He showed no particular talent for it. You can go on and on with this, by the way. I don't mean to become successful, it's important that you first failed at school. I don't mean that. I don't mean that, of course. What I do mean is that these are egregious examples of people whose particular talents weren't uncovered at school, and there are many more, including many of us in the room, who have other talents. You don't have to be, a BAFTA winner or, get the President's Medal or change the course of history to know this is true, that human beings are teeming with possibilities. So Adeline is among them, and in the ordinary, but we all are, but in the ordinary way of things, like most children, she will, in the next couple of years, learn to speak. She doesn't now, but she will, in all probability, and all children do, unless there's particular reasons why, physically or otherwise, why they can't. But the interesting thing about this, you see, is there is a big difference between learning, education, and school. Learning is a natural process for human beings. We are, as I say, learning organisms. Learning is the process of acquiring new skills and understanding. And we do it naturally. We do it throughout our lives. And we do it especially in the first few years. Like every other child, Adeline, in the ordinary course of events, will go through the most extraordinary metamorphosis, a metamorphosis that will rival what happened to her in the womb. When you grow from a small seed to, a viable baby within 9 months. I mean, the most extraordinary process. And then, between now and 15, like every other child, she'll develop cognitively, she'll deepen her understanding of the world around her, she will develop spiritually, she'll become more attuned to issues of value and relationships, she'll develop socially, she will develop emotionally and physically. She will be unrecognizable 15 years from now from the child she is now. This is true of all of us, and that never stops until it does. We are always growing, a constant process of organic change. I mean, it's always the case with every human being. We're here fleetingly, for a fleetingly short time, and it's an extraordinary journey, an extraordinary arc in the sky that we all describe during this period of growth and development. It's fueled by our capacity for learning in part. There's another thing I want to mention in just a minute. So she will learn, as most children do, to learn to speak. What's interesting about this is, to me, is that nobody will teach you to do it. If you've got children, how many of you have got children, by the way? Okay, well, did you teach them to speak? No, you don't. And the reason you didn't is because you couldn't. You don't know how you do it either. And kids don't take instruction at that age, and in any case, it would be impossible. It's too complicated. You don't sit your child down, do you, at the age of 18 months, and say, look, we need to talk. Or more specifically, you do. And this is how this is going to work. You probably noticed your father and I are making all these noises for the last 18 months. I know it's all been rather confusing, but not to us, you see, because some of these noises we're making are the names of things. We call them nouns. There'll be about 5,000 of them you'll have to pick up. Some of the noises we make are not the names of things, they're the names of things we do with things. We call them verbs. They're action words. And by the way, if you modulate the tone of your voice at the end of the word, you can indicate whether you have done something or whether you're about to do something. And don't worry about the subjunctive. Honestly, nobody gets it. It's... You'll figure it out. It'll be fine. So it doesn't happen. Kids absorb language through a process of cultural osmosis. It just enters their system because they can and because they want to. And they don't just learn to speak. They learn what sort of behaviors are appropriate. They learn about relationships. They learn about where boundaries are, if there are any boundaries. They learn about how to conduct themselves in the world, what they can get away with, what they can't. They start to learn about their identity. All of these things are untaught, but learned. There's a difference between learning, education, and school. All kids love to learn. They don't all like education. And some of them have a very bad time at school. Education, as I see it, is a more formal process of learning. It's an organized program where it's an intentional program, not just an accidental one, but where we set out to do something specific and organize a program to help us do that. You can do it on your own, people do, but the most extended experience we all have of education is K-12, where other people have taken it upon themselves to organize things for us. And we have to go through it. And there are a couple of reasons at the heart of it why we organize these systems. One of them is that there are things we want our children to learn which we feel, I'm talking about K-12, which we don't want to leave to chance. Important cultural ideas, historical ideas, scientific ideas, which culturally we've come to believe are an important part of every child's growth and development. And of course, different cultures take a different view of what those things are. It's what the argument is always about when it comes to the curriculum, like what matters. But that is the heart of it. We think some things matter more than others, and we want them to be not left to chance. And the other reason that's why I have a curriculum. The other reason is there are some things that we believe are too difficult for kids to learn on their own. They need help and support to do that. Like calculus. It doesn't matter how much of a devotee you are of learning by discovery. Honestly, it's a slightly optimistic view that the average 8-year-old will go off and do what it took Leibniz and Newton a lifetime to come up with. So education is a formal program. Not all kids get on with that. And school, kids have a problem with. Now, I'm not against schools at all. On the contrary, I'm very for schools. Schools, as I see it, at the heart, a school is a community of learners. People who come together to learn with and from each other. That's it. This is a school tonight, isn't it? It's been a school all day. People who come together, community people who come to learn with and from each other. Kids don't have a problem with school because they're learning from each other all the time. What they have a problem with is how we've come to do school since the introduction of mass systems of education. And I agree with the panel earlier that it's now vital that we rethink, reimagine, reinvent, and transform how we do school. Because for all the benefits that education has brought, it has not fulfilled the promise of equal opportunities for all. It's not addressing the issues of social equity, either among genders or among people of different cultural backgrounds, different ethnicities. And it's being tilted in all kinds of directions against those purposes by a whole range of different vested interests. And to me, it's what Nelson Mandela once said, that education is the most revolutionary force there is if we get it right. And it's the getting it right that concerns me. And to do that, what I want to, when people talk about going back to basics, I think we need to do just that. Go back to basics and ask, what is this thing about? And my take on it is this. Education as a term is an example, isn't it, of what Walter Bryce Galley, the philosopher, once called an essentially contested concept. And what he meant by that, I think, is that there are some ideas, some concepts, which in their nature will provoke disagreement. We're not going to sort them out. To everyone's satisfaction, like justice. What counts as justice for some is not what would count as justice for others. Freedom is one of those terms. People think they know what freedom is until they start to talk about it. It's interesting, isn't it? The framers of the Constitution, who talked about liberty and the pursuit of happiness for all, kept slaves and saw no contradiction in doing that. This was essentially what brought the country to its knees during the Civil War. People were able to hold one idea in the head, which is in direct contradiction with the practice they took. So something like freedom you would take to be a very straightforward idea. It turns out to be very difficult. It's a contested idea. Civil rights is another one of those, even given the Bill of Rights. And education is one of those. People argue about education all kinds of ways. I remember when I was at college, I did Latin at school, by the way, just so you know. That's who you're dealing with. Actually, I love Latin. I'm not good at it, but I loved it. I had two favorite subjects at school. I loved Latin, actually three. Obviously not maths, is it? English, French, and Latin were my things. And I liked Latin because we had eccentric Latin teachers. They're just really odd, I went to a grammar school, and it was a bit like Hogwarts, it's one of those places. And so we had these people gliding up and down the staircase in black gowns, and I just thought, this is wonderful. And we had a French teacher. Now, I love French, at school. Actually, I loved the French teacher. Well, I did. Mr. Evans. It's a long story. But Mr. Evans really impressed me. This was at Liverpool in the mid-1960s. And Mr. Evans stood out. I mean, firstly, he could speak French, which honestly was not true of most French teachers I came across. It did not. Often people talk French whose real job was to run the local football team, and it was like a second strand. And secondly, he had garlic. I thought it was a drug, but he'd had garlic. It made him so exotic to us because he smelt of it, And he was a young, groovy guy, by the way. He's like 35 and in this kind of flash suit. He smoked Gitan cigarettes. It didn't get more exotic than that, except that he had a French wife. Well, for us, teenagers in Liverpool, that was like beyond our expectations. I mean, so Mr. Evans was, to us, he was just a role model. And it's often that way, isn't it? You get into things because you're impressed with people who are good at something. So I like Latin for that reason. So when I was at college, I remember people saying, look, the meaning of education is to draw out, because it comes from the Latin word educo, meaning to draw out or to lead out. It turns out there are two Latin words, educo. There's educo educere, which I think is the third conjugation verb, which means to lead out. The root of education is the Latin word educo educare, which is first conjugation, which means to educate. I'll just tell you that for what it's worth, frankly. They were baffled as well. So I felt for my own purposes it was important to say, I published a book recently on education, to say what I meant by education. And my starting point is this. By the way, in case you're getting panicking, because I know you had to bolt down your food, didn't you? I thought that was great. Go out and relax, but get back here in 5 minutes. And I'm conscious that I'm the only thing that stands between you and the bar now, so I know the clock's ticking here, because I need a drink too, so don't worry. This isn't going on forever. But, so my starting point for all this is that all of us live in two worlds and not one. And it's not an original insight, it's just an important one to remember that like my granddaughter and all children, there was a world we inhabit, all of us, that is here whether or not we're in it. It's a world that was here before you came. It's the world of history and circumstance and other people and objects and events. It was here before you came. It'll be here after you've gone. It's the world that exists whether or not you exist, that exists independently of you being in it. I don't mean you have no impact on it, but it was here anyway. I'm trying to remember that you may remind me, one of the great American authors, he was asked towards the end of his life, what had he learned about life? And he summed it up in 3 words. He said, it goes on. And there's a fundamental truth in that, that no matter what our private griefs may be, life continues its long march. But so part of the role of education is to help people understand that world, the world they're being born into, to make some sense of it. What is it? How does it work? Can it be changed? What are all its diverse cultures and practices, and what place may we have in it, and how can we make our way in it? But there's another world that exists only because you exist. It's the world that came into being when you did, and is only here because you are. It's the world of your own private consciousness, your interior world, the world that is who you are, that came into being because you did, and will end when you continue on or transform according to your own view of things. And there's a passingly slim chance that you would be here at all. I mean, there's an old Italian proverb that says you should never worry about getting old. That it's a privilege denied to many. And that's fundamentally true. Living in California, where people seem determined to stop the clock, by whatever chemical means available, it seems ridiculous. But it is the case. We're here for a fleetingly short time, and part of our great challenge is to understand not only the world within us, but the world around us and the relationship between the two, because we only really understand one in terms of the other. And in my view, education has to address both of those things. Our interior world and the world around us and the relationship between them. So that's my starting point, and to say that then education has various roles. They're economic, they're cultural, they're social, and they're personal. And it's increasingly important to me that we recognize the nature of the personal character of education. When I say we're learning organisms, we're something else. Human beings are invested with deep powers of creativity. What I mean by that is well, there are three terms: imagination, creativity, and innovation. Imagination is the ability to bring to mind things that aren't present. Creativity is putting that capacity to work. It's applying your imagination to something. And it's because of that that we occupy a different space to the rest of life on Earth. Not one that's unrelated, on the contrary, but different. It seems to me that human beings have always lived in a virtual reality. We don't experience the world directly as other creatures seem to. We live in a world of theories and ideas and values and artifices and artifacts. And the reason is that we are curious and we can speculate and hypothesize and we can realize our thoughts in practical creative projects. And it's what is at the heart of all cultural practices, because in the end, like Adeline learning to speak, we don't all just live in a personal vacuum. We learn with and from each other. And when we learn with and from each other, we create a culture, which is a way of being together, a way of acting, behaving, and sharing similar values. And if we grow up in different communities, we believe often in different things and behave in different ways. Now, I believe that the role of education, which began mass education in the 19th century to meet the needs of industrialism, has got to be fundamentally transfigured because of the unique challenges that we now face, which are unprecedented. The current systems of education are rooted in an old model as a myth that I grew up with, which was true, but is now mythical, which is if you went to school, worked hard on academic sorts of things, went to university and got a degree, you would get a job for life and everything would be great from there on. That, by the way, was true for my generation, pretty much. I mean, that's why I'm standing here. I did all that. I went to college, I got a degree, I did a PhD, and, well, you can see the effect it's had on me. There was a Secretary of State in the UK, an old Oxbridge guy, who to me was a walking nightmare of prejudice and nonsense. And he said he had an academic education. He said, and that's what made me who I am. I said, well, there we go. If ever there was an argument for not doing it. But I said it's got perverted, and I just want to say why I think it's got perverted before we go and have a drink. What's happened is, in the past 20 years particularly, well, firstly, education was always designed with the interests of the economy in mind. The education system, as I see it, the mass systems of education in the West, have always lived with a contradiction. One is they grew up in the context of industrial expansion to meet the needs of the new industrial economy, which required a workforce about 80% manual and about 20% clerical and administrative. It was designed to do that. So organizationally, as you were saying earlier from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, organizationally, our education systems are modeled on the principles of industrial output. They are linear in conception. They're stratified according to perceived ideas of quality. People are educated in batches by age, which is an extraordinary thing to do. We don't do that to kids anywhere else. When kids leave school in the afternoon, we don't send them to separate compounds by age. It's just an educational idea. It's not an educational principle, by the way. It's an efficiency principle. And like all industrial processes, there's a vast amount of waste, which we tolerate because it's an intensive process to produce a particular type of commodity. And it's why, for example, in the American system right now, appallingly huge numbers of kids don't graduate high school, and frightening numbers of them end up in the prison system as a consequence. It would be wrong, totally wrong, to say if you leave school, you go to jail. That's clearly not true. What is true is an awful lot of people in the prison system did not graduate from high school. And it's not because they don't want to be educated, it's because the system isn't interested in what they're capable of or what they could be. And of course, it adversely affects disproportionately people of color, and particularly young men. So the system is not functioning in anything approaching the way it might be. And the reform movements of the past 20 years, back to the golden days of the Bush administration, with No Child Left Behind, have compounded the problem. Like most reform movements, they've been based on three principles: standardization, compliance, and competition. And instead of having this liberating process of education where people are able to discover their talents, the world within them, the world around them, and to create a life that adds up to one of purpose and meaning in a reciprocating community, we've created this rather odd thing. I want to show you a couple of pictures. I want to show you this picture so as to underline the fact that this presentation has been prepared. This has been thought about in advance, in case you think I'm just up here having a think. Work has gone into this. You all recognize that. This is I discovered this hole earlier, look at that. It's like David Copperfield, isn't it? This is an image, is it not, that we're all familiar with. This is one of the flexion points in the education system. This type of thing, it comes to this eventually. You have to jump these hurdles. I want to show you a different picture, which is similar to it, which is this one. Let me tell you what this is. This is a picture taken in the Indian state of Bihar a few years ago. I don't speak here in criticism of the Indian state of Bihar, which has very many challenges, and the local people in Bihar and the political group were outraged when this was published a few years back, but let me tell you what this is. This is, in that building, there are students taking a test which is critical to their progression to the next stage of education. The people hanging on the walls are their parents who are handing cheat sheets through the window to help them get through the test. What you can't see are all the parents standing on the ground waiting their turn to go up and hand their kids these papers. Now, this to me is understandable because that's the game, but it's also a perversion of the whole idea of education as a process of economic, social, cultural, and personal development. But I show it to you not because I think we ought to be pointing the finger at Bihar, but because we're doing this here in America. Figuratively, our parents are being driven up the wall by this pressure of testing and intense competition. And it's all in the interest of a failing model. The failing model is, I'm talking to some European countries at the moment about attempts they're making to transform the education system. There are a couple of flexion points in the system. One of them is this: we have become obsessed in America, if I can say so, my fellow Americans. We have become obsessed, not just here, but in Asia and in Europe too, with the idea of people going to university. Now, I'm not knocking universities. I worked in a university. I was a professor in university. I did a PhD. I write books. You know, it's not like I'm against the whole thing. I like it. I like academics. I mean, I love people who get obsessed and absorbed with a particular thing. I liked it. It works for me. But one of the reasons that universities have become such a thing is, firstly, that we have come to elevate the idea of academic ability above everything else. When I say there was a contradiction at the heart of public education, on the one hand, it was developed to meet the needs of an industrial economy, and its organizational model is industrial output. But the content of education was modeled on the needs of the universities, who are interested in academic work for every good reason. And for some reason, historically, academic work has become seen as the holy grail of all forms of intellectual achievement. And it is important, but it's not ultimately the only thing that matters. It's also curious, isn't it, that politicians believe unless we raise academic standards, the world will go to hell in a handbasket. And yet, the easy way to knock down any argument is to say it's purely academic. And the easy way to discredit anybody's comment on a practical problem is to say, well, they're just academics, they live in ivory towers, how would they know? So the idea that a world of theory and ideas is the salvation to the practical challenge that we face only is a big problem. So the first issue here is that our education systems are preoccupied with getting to university on the basis that if you get a degree, you'll get a job. And we all know, you've been talking about it all day, I have no doubt, that the value of a university degree is still present. There is still a graduate dividend, but it's declining. And we're producing more and more people who have no hope of getting a job in the world for which they're qualified. Alongside all this, we have this problem of youth unemployment. I'm sure you talked about it. These are figures for Europe, but the same things apply in America. Despite the billions of dollars being invested in education in Europe, levels of youth unemployment are at historically high levels. That's kids between 15 and 24. This is the average for adult unemployment. Sorry, the average overall, I'm sorry. This is the average for adult unemployment. It runs, between 5 and 10%. Youth unemployment is always about twice that as an average. That's the overall range of youth unemployment. In some European countries around the Mediterranean, 50% plus of young people are out of work, between 15 and 24. Not only out of work, have never been in work, are disengaged, disaffected, have no purchase at all in their own economic future. There are parts of America that mirror this exactly in some of the old industrial rust belts, some of the inner cities. Now, for them, the lure of a university education is not as attractive as it would be for others, but the other price we've paid for this is that we have demoted and denigrated the idea of vocational education in our education systems. Working with your hands is suddenly seen to be, well, it has been for a long time, because of the academic preoccupation, it's seen as a lower level, lower status activity. And so very many people who could have found fulfilling work and careers are about to discover that they have no real future because they neither have the inclination to do an academic degree, or even if they were to do it, they wouldn't find that they had the opportunity available to them. This is a big structural problem, as I see it, at the very heart of the education system. And there are some ways, I think, in which we can tackle it. I mean, there's more that we could say about it, but I think what I said, the reflection points, one of them is this stranglehold of the universities on K-12 education, because the whole of K-12 has now become an obsessive race to get to college. And the constrictions on the K-12 curriculum come entirely from the requirements of university entrance. So I think the first thing we have to really look hard at is diversifying the pathways from high school into what happens beyond high school, and not be so obsessed with getting a degree that may or may not be of interest, because so many kids go to college anyway and don't complete the program and then are lost to themselves and to the workforce. The second is, this principle of competition has some merit. I'm not knocking it. I mean, I have just sat through the World Cup. You know, competition can be good, even though, sadly, on occasion, the best team doesn't win. What can I tell you? I blame Putin, you know. No, I meant to say I don't blame Putin. I don't blame Putin, that's what I meant. But what holds our societies together is not competition. That's an important part of it. But what holds our communities together, our societies, our cities, is collaboration. Human beings are not only endlessly curious, we are deeply collaborative creatures. That's how we build these civilizations. It's how we build these complex infrastructures. And these competencies of collaboration and the sharing of knowledge and expertise are simply not being taught in the system. And the third is, we have to do what I think Course Hero is beginning to do brilliantly, which is to share ideas, materials, and strategies as broad and as generous as we can across the education system. All of these things, of course, are running against the general grain of how education has developed so far. A couple of years ago, kind of in response to my doing those TED Talks, I think some people thought I was saying schools kill creativity. I never said that. That wasn't my title, by the way. I think the title of the talk I gave was Do Schools Kill Creativity? There's good reasons to think that in many ways they inhibit it. But I'm also a lifelong educator, and I have spent my life promoting the possibility of more creative approaches to teaching and learning, and know there are brilliant schools everywhere doing it. So I wrote this book there, and let me just say, by the way, this book is terrific. You would be foolish not to buy this book, to be honest. But in it, I gave a lot of examples of things that I think, of deflection points in the system that we can address, and the room for innovation within the system as it currently is. I mean, yes, we need to transform the whole thing, but there are lots of things that go in education which aren't the result of legislation. They're just habit. They're just things we've become used to doing, and there are lots of room, and we heard it from the panel earlier, lots of things you can do already without waiting for some politician to get in position to give you permission to do it. This fascinates me. It's the last thing I want to say. I'm going to show you a quick video. The last thing I want to say about it is that the system is changing. We've heard evidence of this today. That's why I feel optimistic. It's not that it's not happening. It's not happening fast enough. It's not happening everywhere. But as somebody once said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So we know what can be done and how to make these things happen more effective than we have done. But the room for change, I think, is evident. It's the Gandhi thing. You know, we have to be the change that we want. I was born. I mean, I've been fascinated recently, as many of us are, of that countries across the world, and in America, every state of the union has recently, relatively recently, passed legislation to approve same-sex marriage. And great. What struck me about this was that, I mean, is that it went through I know a lot of people sacrificed a great deal. But when it came, and fought very hard for this, but when it came to the public at large voting, it kind of happened. And this change didn't happen because members of Congress went on a retreat in Aspen and decided it was about time they went back to their constituencies and persuaded the electorate to go along with this idea that they had cooked up in Aspen. In fact, on the contrary, it happened because the country changed its mind about something, and politicians had to respond to it. Now, not everybody's in agreement with it. We know that. It's a contested idea. But I grew up, I was born in Liverpool in 1950. I'm a child of the 60s. I'm a boomer. I lived in England during the 60s. I lived through the sexual revolution. You should know this. I missed it, actually, to be honest. So I didn't go out that weekend. That's very annoying. But I noticed there was a different atmosphere when I did go out. I thought, hang on. I wish I'd not stayed on Sunday now. But at the height of the so-called sexual revolution, the first wave of feminism, actually the second or third wave as it was, the contraceptive pill, the impact of rock music and popular culture, the kind of post-war rebound of the boomers, all of that period, at the height of all of that, nobody was discussing same-sex marriage. It just wasn't a thing. It wasn't on the agenda. People were trying to legalize same-sex relationships. They weren't talking about same-sex marriage. It's just interesting that less than a generation on, it's gone through. In countries that you would have thought this would never happen. My wife is from Ireland. Her family's from Ireland. Ireland, the south of Ireland, a couple of years ago, became the first country in the European Union to approve same-sex marriage. Ireland. And they also, are you from Ireland? Yeah, well, that's true, isn't it? And also, now you're not allowed to smoke a cigarette in a pub in Ireland. Smoking's banned in Ireland. So, if you went into a coma 15 years ago and you woke up in a pub in Dublin, you'd find yourself surrounded by same-sex couples who couldn't smoke. And what happened? But what I mean is, this didn't happen overnight. It's a long cultural shift. And change does happen. People change their minds collectively. And it's seeing where the energy is going in that direction. I think this is happening in education. More and more people are beginning to think differently about education. They're unsettled with the current system, and it can change. So it is about being the change, and there's a lot of room for change, even in the system as it is. The last thing I just want to show you, it only takes a couple of minutes, and then we'll all go and get drunk. No, we don't want to see this. Forget this. This is something called the Sigmoid Curve. A wonderful man called Charles Handy talks about this. It's about the life of organizations. Because organizations, in the end, are very much like human beings. They're organic. They are made up of communities of people who reciprocate and work together. They're not impersonal entities. They're made up of people's actions and beliefs and their behaviors. The natural course of most organizations, they start with an idea, they grow, if they survive. Like a child, they become buoyant, they reach a point of peak maturity, and then they decline. And it's why most organizations have a very limited lifespan. Most commercial organizations have a lifespan of much less than 30 years. Public institutions are a bit longer. But universities are suffering now at this point because their original conception, the way they were conceived, the way they're being operated, is no longer fit for purpose. And many universities are at risk now of climate change, of people deserting them because they don't see the value of them anymore, they can't afford it, and they don't see the dividend. But the difference between a living organism, like an organization like a university, and a mechanical one is you can reinvent, or like an individual, you can reinvent yourself. And this is what Charles Handy describes, the point at which, if you don't wait until you go across the peak, if you start to reinvent while there's energy in the system, you can continually reinvent. And big companies do that, and universities do. And I think that's the point we're at with the university system. And the way it'll be reinvented is through greater collaboration with the K-12 sector, freeing schools up to do what they do best and not just obsessed with university entrance, by encouraging collaboration between teachers across disciplines, because that's the key to all of this, and also closer collaboration between colleges, the vocational sector, the commercial sector, and the cultural sector. It's an area that I've worked in extensively. This is the one thing I want to show you. This is, in creative schools, I gave an example of this one project. There are lots of examples, but I'll just show you like this one. It's one that embodies some of these things. This is a school in Kansas City that had a very interesting after-school program called Mind Drive. These kids were suffering desperately, And a group of people from the community came together, designers, architects, and engineers, and came up with a project called MindDrive, which is now one of the most successful in the school. I think you'll like it. I'll just show it. I'll say a word about it afterwards, then we'll go and get drunk. Oh, before we do, I promised Andrew I'd say something about failure. You cannot be creative if you're not prepared to fail. I ran a commission with the British government a number of years ago, now 20 years ago, and one of the people on the group was a fantastic group. One of the people was a man called Professor Sir Harry Kroto, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. I asked him how many of his experiments failed. He said about 95% of them, I should think. He said, but failure is not the right word. What you're finding is what doesn't work. And that's part of every process of creative inquiry. So how we picture and promote the idea of not having to get it right is deeply important. I came across this cartoon by an Indian cartoonist. I thought it was rather lovely, that this is what we're telling people in schools. If you keep failing, you're done. But the spirit of innovation is like this, that you learn from and use them as steps towards success. And I think this is the message we ought to be contributing to our students, that failure is the natural way of things if you live an exploratory life. So this is MindDrive.
There's a lot of violence, drugs, gun violence, gangs and things like that.
Most of the people that I know, they do drugs, they went to juvie, jail.
Like, if I would have kept doing what I was doing, I'd probably be sitting in jail, or my mom would have kicked me out by now.
We really wanted to form a program for high school kids. People think that at the high school age it's too late, and we're here to prove that it's not too late.
MindDrive is an after-school program for kids, and we teach them about math and science, technology, the environment, through hands-on projects. This year, we took a Karmann Ghia that was in pretty bad shape. The kids restored it, literally from the bottom up, and then they converted it to be electric.
We stripped everything out of it, from the seats to the motor, every part. Kids my age built a car.
We're actually powering our car by social media, by having a device that will take your connections to us and turn it into social fuel and literally allow us to power the car between Kansas City and Washington, D.C.
We need enough tweets and enough Instagram pictures and Facebook posts to get this car started so we could tell legislators about MindDrive and what great influences it has on kids.
I want to thank everyone for coming today to kick off the MindDrive Social Tour.
It's go time.
So they're making all these presentations, getting interviewed by the press, and then we start to see this spike in the social fuel.
People are tweeting about us, so our car is allowing us to drive it.
We find out that Mashables picked it up, and then we find out that Richard Branson wrote a blog about us. These students, they're really starting to feel like rock stars. The thing that surprised me the most was how broad the response was internationally.
Being able to go to Washington, D.C., you got a voice to spread the word, and not a lot of people get to do that.
Learning stuff like this is fantastic. It's hands-on. You know, that's the thing that makes, innovation, invention, create things, make things better, and it actually makes the world a better place.
MindDrive has told me you could go for it.
Well, I plan on graduating high school and going to University of Kansas.
I want to become a district attorney.
Everyone believes in you, and I think when we don't believe in ourselves, they do.
We're family, basically.
When I think of MindDrive, I feel love.
I think that's what's entailed in reinventing education. It's about diversity, it's collaboration, and multiple pathways to success. There's a big wraparound issue here, which is that we are living in unprecedented times, are we not? We're living in a world which has more people in it than ever before. We're heading to a population of 9 billion by the middle of the century, more connected than ever before. We're exhausting the Earth's resources at an astonishing rate. And although we're more connected and economically buoyant in some areas, there's no real indication yet, is there, that we are evolving spiritually as rapidly as we're developing technologically. You don't have to look at how these wonderful devices are being used for purposes which are destructive very often and nefarious. I'm not saying this to be moralistic. I'm simply saying that we are advancing more quickly materially than we are in our ability to connect to each other and to be collaborative and synergistic with other people's worldviews. And we face a big environmental challenge. We're living through it now, the summer of fires, and we're living through, in a world, if you look at Madeleine Albright's latest book about the rise of nationalism, at a time when the world's becoming more divided again. I mean, what's kept the peace on the planet, in the Western world at any rate, for so long is the axis between America and Europe, and that's beginning to be eroded. And I think these are very dangerous developments and unprecedented challenges, and education is at the heart of the strategies we need to help our attempts to address these challenges collectively and individually. At the very beginning of the 20th century, H.G. Wells, who was one of the people who had some success in predicting the future, made a comment, and he said that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. I think that's exactly right. We have deep potential, but education is the process by which we cultivate our understanding not just of ourselves, but of the world around us. And to have it reduced to a competition of standardization to get into certain sorts of institutions and of competition seems to me a perversion of its fundamental principles. And we all know it who work in it. And I think our role in the education system is to try and transform it from the inside out while also doing what we can to persuade our politicians to create a climate in which this can happen. I think it's an historic challenge. And we ought not to take for granted, the levels of material welfare that many people currently benefit from. And we ought not to overlook the spiritual void that it's all creating. According to the World Health Organization, the second largest cause of mortality by 2020 among human populations will be depression. Depression, at a time when most people are better off materially than ever before in history. People now, even among some of the poorest people on the planet, are living in the world which was inconceivably better materially than people who are living in working class communities at the beginning of the 20th century. But of course it turns out that happiness and well-being are not material states at all. I mean, they are conditions of the spirit. And there is a void here that education can also help to fill, not on our own, but in concert with others. So I think it's very important not to underestimate the scale of the task and the challenge, but also not to underestimate the scale of our resources to deal with it. But it does take a different vision for education and a different will to transform it. That's why I think that meetings like this are so important, and why the work of groups like Course Hero and making resources available to people across sectors is also strategically so valuable. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the day. Thank you.